Okay, friends, welcome. We're going to get started now. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us tonight on this evening of Friday, October 4th. It's a very special evening because we have a very special guest joining us, Mr. Chas Freeman. I'm going to talk a little bit about the format of tonight's event. It's going to begin with a talk from Ambassador Freeman titled, "Is the Zionist State Now Doing Itself In?" After his talk, we'll wrap up the program with the Q&A session. So that's going to be the format of tonight's event. His talk is it's going to give us some very important context, historical context of the situation in the Middle East. And as far as the more recent and current events, we'll hopefully touch on those in the Q&A portion. When I invited Mr. Freeman to speak with Community Church of Boston, I shared with him a little bit about our history at the community church. For example, we've had many remarkable speakers over the last 100 or so years, over 100 years now. And one of those speakers, repeat speakers, was W.E.B. Du Bois. The last talk he gave us was in 1959, titled "Life in Socialist Lands," and he gave that talk after returning from a trip in China and the Soviet Union. And it was only a few years before he ended up moving to Ghana, where he spent the rest of his life. Ambassador Freeman responded very kindly to my email, and he shared with me an interesting story that I want to share with you all now. That is, here it is. Booker T. Washington actually offered the position of private secretary to W.E.B. Du Bois. And W.E.B. Du Bois proudly declined the position, saying he would work for no man other than himself. The person who ended up accepting the position served in it from 1905 to 1914, and he was named Robert Ezra Park. Robert Ezra Park happens to be the great-grandfather of our guest speaker tonight, Mr. Chas Freeman. So that was an interesting story that I wanted to share. Ambassador Freeman is a career diplomat who was Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs from 1993 to 1994, when he earned the highest public service awards from the Department of Defense. He served as U.S. Ambassador to Saudi Arabia from 1989 to 1992 during Operations Desert Shield and Desert Storm. Ambassador Freeman worked as Deputy Chief of Mission and Chargé d'Affaires, sorry if I mispronounced that, in the American embassies both in Bangkok and Beijing. In Bangkok from 1984 to 1986, and in Beijing from 1981 to 1984. He was the Director of Chinese Affairs at the U.S. Department of State from 79 to 81, and he was the principal American interpreter during President Nixon's path-breaking visit to China in 1972. In addition to his Middle Eastern, African, East Asian, and European diplomatic experience, very extensive diplomatic experience, he also had a tour of duty in India. It is my honor to introduce and welcome Ambassador Chas Freeman. Welcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Amr. I guess what you were trying to say is I couldn't keep a job. But anyway, here I am. And I have about 25 minutes of prepared remarks, and I hope you will bear with me for that length of time. And it's really, and then we will have what I hope will be a lively discussion of the terrible events that are now occurring in West Asia. That is, between Israel and Yemen, between Israel and the Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank, between Israel and Lebanon, and between Israel and Iran, and we might mention Syria as well. So with no further ado, let me begin. There will always be an Israel. It is a theological ideal and mythic memory that has survived millennia in the minds of observant Jews. Some Christians link Jewish dominance of Palestine to the second coming of Christ and the end of days. The multinational religious communities that profess Judaism will ensure Israel's permanence as an idea. But both the Zionist state of Israel and the Jews who inhabit it are now in jeopardy. Palestine is where the humane values of Judaism have gone to die. An abbreviated history seems appropriate. The first Christians were Jews, but European Christendom never applied the brotherly love Jesus taught to the Jews in its midst. Instead, it classified them as socio-religious pariahs, an alien caste. Like the castes of India, Jews married only each other, had a distinctive religious identity, and were restricted to specialized socioeconomic roles. In the case of European Jews, this meant occupations involving money lending and other sorts of financial engineering. European xenophobia, called anti-Semitism when directed at Jews, resulted not just in their persecution, but in their occasional pillage and murder, for example, by crusaders preparing to conquer the Holy Land from its mostly Muslim inhabitants. It's fair to say that the Holocaust, the greatest atrocity of the 20th century among many, was less an innovation than the culmination of centuries of prejudice and persecution of Jews by other Europeans. Against this background, it's easy to understand the appeal of Zionism, an effort to transform Jewish religious identity into a national identity and to set up a state in which Jews would be a ruling majority rather than a vulnerable minority. Zionism's proponents argued that Jews, like other European ethno-linguistic groups, were entitled to self-determination. Ironically, Zionism thus embraced European Christendom's anti-Semitic designation of Jews, not as adherents of a religious faith, but as a people distinct from other Europeans. European anti-Semites thought it would be just dandy to get rid of the Jews in their midst, but where should they go? What better than to export them to one of European colonialism's many overseas colonial dominions? Most of the original Zionists were not themselves religious, but they judged correctly that locating their proposed state in the mythic homeland of Judaism, Palestine, would grant it a religious legitimacy it would otherwise lack. As Ilan Pappé, the noted Israeli historian, has quipped, they didn't believe in God, but insisted that God had promised Palestine to them. And with the religious condescension typical of European imperialism, they ignored the presence of an indigenous population in their proposed homeland, describing Palestine as, quote, a land without people, unquote, for the, quote, people without land, unquote, that they were in the process of inventing. As the Ottoman Empire imploded during the First World War, Britain, in an act intended to undermine Jewish support for Germany, declared its support for, quote, the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, unquote, provided that, quote, nothing shall be done to prejudice the rights of existing non-Jewish communities, unquote, there. But for the Jews colonizing Palestine, the whole point was to establish Jewish supremacy there, not to affirm the rights of its non-Jewish inhabitants. A multifaceted Zionist campaign to dispossess the indigenous Palestinian Arab population was soon underway. In the late 1930s, the increasingly brutal Nazi persecution of Jews in Germany led to a surge in Jewish immigration to Palestine. This set off the 1936 to 1939 so-called Great Palestinian Revolt against both British rule and Zionist colonization. Britain reacted in 1939 by issuing a white paper proclaiming a policy of establishing a Jewish homeland through regulated Jewish immigration to an unpartitioned, independent state of Palestine, which was to come into being within 10 years. Palestinian leaders feared this policy would dispossess them and firmly rejected it. For their part, armed Zionist settlers violently resisted its implementation, charging it would put them at the mercy of Palestine's Arab, Muslim, and Christian majority. Prior to World War II, most European Jews opposed Zionism or were indifferent to it. The Nazi Holocaust understandably convinced them that to protect themselves and their posterity from genocide, they needed to set up an exclusively Jewish state in Palestine. After the war, with more desirable safe havens, like the United States denied to them, a mounting flood of European Jews sought resettlement in Palestine. Zionist paramilitaries simultaneously launched violent campaigns against the British authorities, Palestinian Arabs, and Jewish dissenters. Their aim was to achieve self-determination and establish an exclusively Jewish state by ridding Palestine of its indigenous inhabitants. Their targets included civilians, as well as security personnel, government figures, and infrastructure. Parenthetically, in 1991, Yitzhak Shamir, a participant in this terrorist campaign who had become the Prime Minister of Israel, justified Jewish terrorism on the grounds that the Jews, stateless and persecuted, had no choice but to engage in it. By contrast, he asserted, the Palestinians are, quote, fighting for land that is not theirs. This is the land of the people of Israel, unquote. Zionism's morally blind sense of entitlement and reliance on terrorism against its opponents have never varied. In the face of all this, in 1947, the British threw up their hands and tossed the problem of Palestine into the lap of the new United Nations. The UN, then dominated by colonial powers, imperiously recommended the partition of Palestine into two states, one Jewish and one Arab, with the city of Jerusalem under international control. At the time, the population of Palestine was 2/3 Arab and 1/3 European Jewish. The UN plan, nonetheless, awarded 56% of the country, including most of its best agricultural land, to Jewish colonists, while allocating only 42% of it to its native Arabs. Palestinian leaders, joined by every state in the region and nearly independent India, opposed both partition and the UN plan for it as unfair. For newly independent states, the award of territory in Palestine to European Jewish settlers was a terminal affront as the age of racist Western colonialism sputtered to an end. Under intense pressure, including death threats from Zionist activists, the UN General Assembly voted to approve the plan. Zionist leaders accepted it, while complaining that it would burden their proposed state in Palestine with a 40% Arab minority. They began planning to seize more territory, and Jerusalem, if they could. The British right to rule in Palestine was due to expire at midnight on May 14, 1948. In April of that year, a month before, newly augmented Zionist forces began an offensive to secure the cities and territories the UN partition plan had allotted to the proposed Jewish state, to encourage its indigenous inhabitants to leave and to position themselves to seize even more land if the opportunity presented itself. A few hours before the British began their scheduled withdrawal from Palestine, the World Zionist Organization proclaimed the State of Israel and mobilized its armed forces. The next day, military contingents from Egypt, Jordan, Syria, and Iraq entered Palestine. In the ensuing conflict, Zionist forces, many of them battle-hardened by warfare in Europe, took not only the territory assigned by the UN to a Jewish state, but 60% of the territory designated for Palestine's Arabs. The new Israeli armed forces and Jewish militias conducted over 70 documented massacres of Palestinians and terrorized over 720,000 of them into abandoning their homes and fleeing to neighboring countries. Israeli forces also seized West Jerusalem, voiding its proposed status as part of an international city and complicating Jerusalem's continuation as a point of pilgrimage for the world's Muslims and Christians, for whom it was also a holy city. While Jews in the new state of Israel celebrated, those in the broader Arab world almost at once suffered the consequences of their European co-religionists' violent expulsion of over half of Palestine's Arab, Muslim, and Christian populations. Over the course of the next decade, the hate-filled reaction to this catastrophe, a Nakba in Arabic, in Arab countries, led increasing numbers of Jewish Arabs to abandon their homes and flee to Israel. Israel's surprise attacks on Egypt in 1956 and on Egypt, Jordan, and Syria in 1967, as well as its several invasions of Lebanon, then cemented Arab enmity to the Zionist state, fomented Arab and Muslim anti-Semitism, and resulted in the departure of all but a few of the ancient Jewish communities in the Islamic world. Once in Israel, Arab Jews were indoctrinated in the evils of the European Holocaust and assimilated to a national culture based on fear of renewed slaughter of Jews by hateful anti-Semites, equated with the 99.08% of non-Jewish human beings. In its 1967 Six-Day War, Israel gained control of all of Palestine, including East Jerusalem, as well as Syria's Golan Heights. This marked a fateful choice for Zionism. Having invented a Jewish people to populate what it had proclaimed was a land without people, Zionists now faced the inconvenient reality that the land they had seized was, in fact, already populated. Israel could use its victory and its control of Palestine to dictate a basis for Israeli-Palestinian coexistence, or it could persist in implementing policies designed to rid the West Bank and Gaza of their captive Arab populations. True to its Zionist origins, Israel chose to pursue the goal of eradicating all but a vestigial Arab, Muslim, and Christian presence in the Holy Land. In the territories of pre-1967 Israel, a system of apartheid evolved in which the 20% Israeli Arab, Muslim, and Christian minority is discriminated against, segregated from Jewish Israelis, and denied many of the benefits available to Jewish citizens. In the West Bank, martial law evolved into a Kafkaesque system of checkpoints that oppressed and atomized its Palestinian inhabitants by separating them into 165 or so disconnected enclaves and progressively evicting them to make way for Jewish settlements and outposts in hundreds of places selected for their military value to the Israeli occupation and its annexationist agenda. The cumulative result is the Israel of today, in which non-Jewish Arab Israelis are second-class citizens, Arabs in the occupied West Bank are disenfranchised and subject to Jewish settler and military terrorism, while the inhabitants of Gaza are being slaughtered and starved to death. As I speak, the extermination campaign in Gaza has been extended to Palestinians in the occupied West Bank. Occupation brutalizes the forces conducting it. Israel has been no exception. As time has gone on, the Israeli occupation forces and the conscripts that man them have become ever less constrained by morality or empathy for those they violently oppress. In the beginning, Israel used pseudo-legal procedures to dispossess Palestinians in Jerusalem and the West Bank. But as time went on, it came to rely ever more on terrorism by Jewish settlers, aided and abetted by the Israeli military. It is now openly applying the murderous techniques it pioneered in Gaza to the West Bank and to Lebanon. After the withdrawal of Israeli settlements from Gaza in 2005, Israel transformed it into the world's largest concentration camp. It controlled Gaza with periodic invasions and massacres of its inhabitants in a policy that it sardonically called, quote, mowing the grass, unquote. In October 7 last year, just exactly a year from Monday, Palestinians in Gaza, a persecuted people without a state of their own, responded by applying Yitzhak Shamir's logic, the justification of Zionist terrorism, to the Israeli settlers and military reservists on Gaza's periphery. The Zionist state's aim has been to create conditions so intolerable that Palestinians would voluntarily leave, transforming Palestine into the land without people it originally envisaged. In its effort to rid Palestine of its non-Jewish inhabitants, Israel has emerged as the world's most brazen violator of the norms enshrined in international law and the post-war Geneva Conventions. Ironically, the world enacted these conventions precisely to preclude a recurrence of the cruelties that the Nazis and Japanese militarists had inflicted on occupied populations during World War II, most notably the genocide of Europe's Jews. By doing so, Israelis have turned the Star of David on the Israeli flag into a global symbol, not of resilience and redemption, but of genocide and other crimes against humanity. Israel's policies toward its captive populations now blatantly violate the norms the post-war conventions enshrine. To cite just a few obvious examples. Article 49 of the Fourth Geneva Convention stipulates that an occupying power must not transfer parts of its own civilian population into the territory it occupies. Yet the Zionist state settlement of occupied Palestinian lands is still its central mission and activity. Some 720,000 illegal Israeli settlers have dispossessed and now lord over Palestinians in the West Bank. The same article provides that collective penalties, I'm quoting, quote, collective penalties and all measures of intimidation or terrorism are prohibited. Pillage is prohibited. Reprisals against protected persons and their property are prohibited, unquote. Yet these measures are the very means by which Israel has long terrorized the inhabitants of both Gaza and the West Bank. Article 76 of the same convention prohibits an occupying power from murdering, torturing, mutilating, beating, or otherwise brutalizing the population under its control. Yet Israel relies on such sadistic practices, including sodomy and rape, to punish Palestinian prisoners, many of whom are detained without charge. The separate Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide of 1948 defines genocide as destroying a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group in whole or in part. It criminalizes this behavior, the conspiracy to commit it, public incitement of it, the attempt to commit it, or complicity in it. The government of Israel and its army are currently committing every one of these crimes. The foreign governments supplying Israel with arms and protecting it in the United Nations have yet to face formal charges at The Hague, but our folk accomplishes in this genocide. The United Nations Charter demands that all states refrain from the threat or use of force against other states. Customary international law requires reprisals for violations of this prohibition to be proportional to the injury suffered. It restricts preemptive or anticipatory defensive actions to circumstances in which there is, quote, a necessity of self-defense, instant, overwhelming, leaving no choice of means and no moment of deliberation, unquote. Yet Israel repeatedly retaliates disproportionately to any and all affronts, attacks its neighbors preemptively without regard to whether there is evidence of an imminent threat from them, and assassinates both their own officials and Palestinians on their soil. This is not by any means a complete list of Israel's violations of international law and human decency. Israel offends these norms, to which the United States and Europe loudly proclaim allegiance, because it has Western backing to do so. The Zionist state has gotten away with criminally scofflaw behavior because Europeans guilty of anti-Semitism, including aiding and abetting the roundup and slaughter of European Jews, have conferred compensatory immunity on the Jews of Israel. A powerful, unregistered lobby in the United States and the United Kingdom, directed by the Israeli government and funded by native Jewish plutocrats, has made it politically fatal to criticize the behavior of the Zionist state. The Western Bloc in the UN Security Council, the United Nations Security Council, the United States, United Kingdom, and France, has shamelessly protected Israel by vetoing every and all attempts to hold it accountable for its outrageously illegal behavior. Until recently, Israel, aided by biased, self-censoring Anglo-American media, was careful to keep its gross violations of Palestinian human rights below the radar screen. But the October 7 breakout of Palestinians from their incarceration in Gaza inevitably focused global attention on the outrageous Israeli treatment of them that had inspired their criminal atrocities against Israelis just outside Gaza. Israel's subsequent effort to exterminate the Palestinians in Gaza has indelibly shattered the image of Israeli and other Jews as eternal victims. The world now sees Israelis not as survivors of genocide, but as vengeful perpetrators of it, heirs to the Nazis who sought to exterminate them, as they now seek to exterminate the Palestinians. In much of the world, the Star of David has come to evoke the same revulsion as the Nazi swastika does in the West. Israel is not a casual scofflaw. Since its establishment, it has systematically sought to normalize behavior that contravenes international law. As a former head of the Israeli Defense Forces legal department argued, quote, "If you do something for long enough, the world will accept it. The whole of international law is now based on the notion that an act that is forbidden today becomes permissible if executed by enough countries. International law progresses through violations," unquote. A colleague of his pointed out that, quote, "the more often Western states apply principles that originated in Israel to their own non-traditional conflicts in places like Afghanistan and Iraq, then the greater the chance these principles have of becoming a valuable part of international law," unquote. This Israeli strategy of lawfare has succeeded in eroding international law and eliminating American compliance with it. Tolerance of illegality abroad fosters tolerance of it at home, and vice versa. American enablement of Israel's brutal oppression of its captive Arab populations and its wanton warfare on its neighbors has corrupted American politics and constitutional democracy in the United States as much as it has deformed American foreign policy. The result is the current U.S. advocacy of an autocratic so-called, quote, rules-based order, unquote, as an alternative to traditional consensus-derived international law. The United States and its close allies assert the right to proclaim the rules and to decide to whom they should and should not apply. Might is once again to make right. The strong are to do what they can, and the weak to suffer what they must. The world at large considers this approach, which the unconditional U.S. protection of Israel exemplifies for them, to be prima facie sociopathic. For Israel and its neoconservative sycophants in the United States, the ends justify the means, and the ends transparently equate to the establishment of Jewish supremacy, not just in Palestine, but in West Asia. Since its founding in 1948, Israel has steadily expanded without agreeing borders with either the Palestinians or its Arab neighbors. The stripes on the Israeli flag symbolize bodies of water, a river and a sea, or another river. The uniforms of some Israeli troops are adorned with a notorious map that depicts the state of Israel as extending from the Euphrates to the Nile. This reflects the belief of religious Zionists that God once promised this vast territory, consisting of part of Egypt, most of Iraq, all of Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria, as well as northern Saudi Arabia, to the Jews. This is a vision of depopulation through slaughter. Israel now exists. Does Israel does Israel justly claim a right to exist? Not if that implies that no one else has the right to exist, quote, between the river and the sea, unquote. Does it deserve to exist? Not if its existence depends on sadistic violations of human decency and international law. Can the world tolerate the existence of a state that has institutionalized an ethno-religious democracy that survives by dehumanizing and terrorizing a disenfranchised captive population while aspiring to exterminate it? Can it fail forever to take action to stop Israel's indiscriminate slaughter of Palestinians and Lebanese? What's your answer to that? These questions have become, I believe, the transcendent moral issues of our times. The world is watching and weighing the amorality of American enablement of Israeli genocide, persecution, and ethnic cleansing of its captive Arab populations. America's reputation and global leadership are at an historic nadir. Ever more Americans of conscience object to Washington's complicity in Israel's gross violations of human rights and international law. If there is no peace, no path to peace in the Holy Land, Israel's state terrorism will inevitably stoke terrorism against it and the United States, as well as the escalating opprobrium of Israel's neighbors and the global majority. To preclude this, Israel now seeks a regional conflagration, an apocalypse from which its current government believes that with American backing, it will emerge triumphant. The blank check we have given to Israel is not a strategy, it's a tragedy in the making, and it is one for which the world will justly hold the United States responsible. Let's not forget that U.S. taxpayers pay for the Zionist state's misdeeds. Israel has been and still is by far the largest single recipient of U.S. foreign aid. In 1964, in return for financial support from wealthy Jewish American donors for his presidential campaign, then President Johnson agreed to drop America's post-Suez War arms embargo on Israel. Since then, the United States has provided about $250 billion in military aid to Israel. Keeping Egypt at peace with Israel has cost the United States another $165 or so billion. Americans are responsible for Israel's persecution of the Palestinians and wars on its neighbors in ways we are not in other countries whose evil behavior we do not subsidize but condemn. In normal times, Washington funds about 15% of the Israeli defense budget, while unofficially suspending the Leahy Law, which prohibits arms transfers to countries using them to violate human rights and international law. The International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court have both found that that is exactly what Israel is doing. Washington has nonetheless continued to support Israel's extermination campaign in Gaza, turned a blind eye to its pogroms in the West Bank, and backed its murderous attacks on Syria and now Lebanon with at least another $40 billion in emergency aid and over 50,000 tons of weaponry. The government of the United States is funding, arming, and excusing Israel's inexcusable behavior toward both the Palestinians and Israel's neighbors. The world is now calling Americans to account. Will we continue to exempt Israel from accountability for its gross violations of our proclaimed values, our laws, and international norms? Will we persist in allowing it to manipulate our elections to facilitate its suicidal policies? Will we continue to enable its campaign of genocide in Palestine and now Lebanon? Will we follow it into the wider war in West Asia that its current government persists in trying to ignite? I heard nothing at all about these questions at either of our major parties' national conventions. What is to be done? And if we don't demand that it be done, who will? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Freeman. Thank you for those eloquent and important remarks, which people, I hope you can share widely with friends and family and others who might be interested in this. I'm very much looking forward to the Q&A portion, but first I want to make a couple quick announcements for the church. The first is that this program, like most all of our programs, is free to attend, but your generous contributions help us put these programs together and keep our operations running. So if you found any value in tonight's program, please consider donating if you can, and I'll share the donation link in the chat. There it is. Next, just a couple quick announcements about upcoming events at the church. Our Sunday morning meetings are starting again this coming Sunday. We'll have a report back from El Salvador. So that's going to be at Sunday at 11 a.m. Join us if you can. The Community Church of Boston sponsors and supports a group called the JFK, the John F. Kennedy Peace Speech Committee. What the JFK Peace Group does is they hold a screening every month of President John Kennedy's 1963, June 10th, 1963 speech he gave at American University, where he spoke about world peace and he spoke about making peace with the Soviet Union. So every month we screen that speech and have a different person commenting on it. In September, Max Blumenthal was our commentator, and coming up on October 10th, our commentator will be Jill Stein. So I'll share the link for that in the chat in a moment. In November, on November 22nd, which happens to be the 61st anniversary of the assassination of John Kennedy, our guest speaker will be two guest speakers, Mr. Ray McGovern, who's with us on the call right now, and along with him, Scott Ritter. So that's going to be an exciting program. And yeah, I'll share the link for the October program in the chat in a moment. So I'd like to get into Q&A portion now. Mr. Freeman, you said in your remarks that, quote, you said, Israel now seeks a regional configuration, an apocalypse from which its current government believes that with American backing, it will emerge triumphant, end quote. So my question for you is, has this calculation that Israel has made that they'll emerge triumphant from a escalating war, have they considered that, what if they're wrong about that? And or do they feel that they can do whatever they want because they have nuclear weapons and they have the support of the United States?
Israelis are very divided on this. Religious Zionists believe that God will give them victory. That is a faith that they have. They're probably, about 12% or so of the Israeli population. The Israeli military, who are very bright and very competent, and don't believe that victory is possible. The Netanyahu believes that if he can draw the United States into the war, he can achieve victory, and that's been his objective for the past year. Israel has repeatedly been advised by the Biden administration and by others, including most recently Vladimir Putin in Russia, not to provoke its neighbors, not to seek a wider war, not to ignite one. And it has contemptuously dismissed all of this advice and proceeded with a unending series of provocations, as well as continuing the genocide in Gaza. By the way, the commonly cited figure of 40,000 dead Palestinians is absolutely incorrect. Recently, an American medical group who had been there, served in Gaza, estimated that the total was closer to 120,000. The Lancet, the respected British medical journal, estimates it's close to 200,000. So we are, as usual, the victims of very effective propaganda, haspara, the Israelis call it, meaning explanations, which tend to justify their behavior, as well as to slander their opponents. So the question is, does Mr. Netanyahu have a record of following advice from anybody, his own military, his intelligence people, who argue with him that without a political settlement with the Palestinians, a Palestinian state of some sort, that Israel is destined to suffer from constant attacks for as long as it exists. His own intelligence chiefs, when they retire, tend to come out in favor of a Palestinian state for that reason. And yet he ignores all this. And I think on October 7th, he saw an opportunity to do two things, which are integral to Zionism. One was to remove the Palestinians from Gaza, one way or another, either drive them over the border. That was his initial proposal, that they should all go to the Sinai, um, which is not exactly a very habitable place, and is part of Egypt, which didn't want more Palestinians, um, or kill them. And since they weren't driven out, they're being killed. And they are the number of who have been wounded is something north of 100,000. The number who are in jeopardy of dying from starvation is now approximately 500,000. And so we are talking about what is a very large-scale genocide, not a limited thing. That was one of his objectives, and it's now, as I said, been extended to the West Bank. The object there have been over 700 Palestinians killed by settlers, aided and abetted by the Israeli military since October 7, and the drive to complete ethnic cleansing there is in full progress. The second thing he wanted to accomplish is to establish Jewish hegemony, Israeli hegemony, if you will, in the Middle East, West Asia. We very conveniently knocked out Iraq for him. He worked with us to dismember Syria, vivisected, I would say, to use a word that the Indians and Pakistanis like to use. We have counseled Lebanon to be meek and subordinate. We tried very hard to produce a normalization, notwithstanding the Palestinian issue, to bypass it with the so-called Abraham Accords, which are now in deep kimchi and very unlikely to survive too long. I could talk about the Saudi-Israeli normalization farce if you want, but I will leave that aside. And of course, we have been attacking Yemen, which has conducted the world's first effective land-based sea embargo of a country, namely closed down shipping to Israel in the Red Sea. Not always terribly accurately, but it is very clearly concentrating only on shipping that aids and abets Israel in its genocide. Both Hezbollah and the Yemenis have said if Israel stopped its genocide in Gaza, they would cease and desist all attacks on Israel. Israel's not accepted that because Mr. Netanyahu's motivations are complex. If he leaves office, which he will have to do if there's no war, he's very likely to end up in jail for corruption. So he's got a personal motive as well as a vision of being the new conqueror, the new Moses, if you will, the new conqueror of Canaan and the surrounding areas. This is a very powerful motivation, and he's not yielding an inch. And I would say, finally, that one of the major consequences of all this is the utter disempowerment of the United States. We have no demonstrable influence or clout in the region at all. And this is extending beyond the region to other places as well. Every time our very weak President Joe Biden has chided Mr. Netanyahu has made his contemptuous rejection of that advice clear. This is not a recipe for building respect for the wisdom or the power of the United States. So I'll end here.
Yeah, and that brings me to my next question, actually, which is because the U.S. is giving military, financial, and political support to Israel, would you agree that the United States, us, in effect, were partially responsible for a genocide?
We're wholly responsible for it. It's perfectly clear that without those weapons, which I didn't mention, the funding I mentioned, but 50,000 tons of weapons, Israel would have to stop. And its own generals have said that if the United States were to stop supplying Israel with munitions, including the 86 bunker-busting bombs that were dropped to murder Nasrallah in Beirut, they wouldn't be able to carry on the war. So we can't escape complicity and responsibility for this. The more important point, I think, is that the world agrees with that statement. I cannot believe how isolated and parochial we are. I saw Admiral Kirby, who is the Baghdad Bob of the White House, in my view. You remember who Baghdad Bob was. They say with a straight face that no one was mourning the death of Nasrallah. And yet there have been demonstrations and mourning ceremonies throughout the entire Islamic world and in many parts of Europe, and indeed in some parts of the United States. So this is an aggressively disdainful attitude toward the world, and the world perceives it that way. And that isn't going to help us. We have a lot of problems, and we need a peaceful international environment to address them, and we're not going to get it because of this.
Thank you, Ambassador Freeman. We have, I think over we have almost 300 people watching on YouTube right now, and we have a lot of questions coming into the chat on both Zoom and YouTube, and people have their hands raised. So I'm going to do my best to get to everyone's question, and I apologize in advance for not being able to get to every question tonight. So I want to read you a question from the chat, Mr. Freeman. Beth is asking, what is the motivation for the U.S. to support this war?
It's purely domestic politics. There's no strategic advantage to it at all. There is a thesis that we share values with Israel. Well, that's true if the values of the United States are those of the Ku Klux Klan. There's a thesis that we share strategic objectives with Israel. But I don't believe that is the case at all. What interest does the United States have in creating Israeli hegemony in the Middle East? Do we not respect other countries' right of self-determination? And every time we have, and I should say multiple times in the last 76 years of Israel's existence, in Suez, 1967, 1973, multiple other occasions, wars between Israel and the Arab states, most of them started by Israel, but some, as in the 1973 war, started by Arabs, have put us into nuclear confrontations with the former Soviet Union, risked a global conflagration, cost us enormous amounts of wealth, and, for example, the 1973 Arab oil embargo, which some may remember, was not a pleasant time for our country. Israel is not a strategic asset, it's a liability. So I think this old Cold War idea, which might have been true back then, if it was true, is no longer true, clearly.
Okay, I want to give the floor to some of our participants to ask their question. I just ask that please, if we keep our questions brief, that will give us the opportunity to get as many questions as we can.
I'll
So
try to
first
keep
up,
my answers brief.
So first up, we have my friend and community church member, Alan Perez, who I was spending time with earlier today.
Okay,
Alan,
Mr. Perez.
welcome.
Thank you, Ambassador Freeman. A few days ago, I listened President Gustavo Petro from Colombia,
Yes.
and he said that he was deeply disappointed that he didn't see what was the purpose to give a speech at the UN, except if he used a tribune to address the people. By the same token, the Prime Minister of Barbados said something similar. And in my personal opinion, I feel disappointed about the UN. It seems like it's a very useless organization at this point to address international law. And especially, I thought about that when I saw the embassy of Iran in Damascus being bombed. What is your opinion about the state of international law and human rights?
¿Es colombiano usted?
No, I am from Costa Rica. Soy de
Costa Rica. Okay, muy bien. I agree with you that the United Nations, largely because of the paralysis of the Security Council, most of it by American vetoes, some by Russian vetoes, very occasionally by Chinese vetoes, almost all of those having to do with either Ukraine or the Middle East. But the UN is at that level very paralyzed and not useful. And I think it is a place for what I call paraplegic diplomacy. So you can't move your hands and feet, but you can move your mouth, and your brain is still there, and you talk and nothing happens. So this is a sad situation. And in my view, it is time to restructure the United Nations or replace it, much as we did the League of Nations when it proved inadequate in the 1930s. Having said that, let us not write off the multiple agencies of the UN Development Program, UN Human Rights Commission, and the UN Refugee Function, many other functions which are absolutely invaluable and which function, notwithstanding the paralysis of the Security Council. But I would say respect for international law is now at an all-time low, and that has a great deal to do with the story I just gave you about events in Palestine. Una lástima, por favor, por supuesto.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Freeman. Thank you, Alan. I'm going to next read a question from the chat, and then we'll give the floor after that to Mary Jane for her question. Ambassador Freeman, there's a question in the chat. Can you talk to us about how your appointment to the Obama administration basically got torpedoed by the Israel lobby?
Sure. Many years ago, I began to realize that Israel was on a trajectory that I thought would lead to a suicidal outcome. I think we're seeing that now. Israel has lost its moral authority. It has a very damaged economy. Its army is tired. It is divided. It is losing its democracy with the attempt by the Netanyahu cabinet to suspend judicial independence. It has always enjoyed the unified support of Americans. Americans are now divided on this question. But we are not alone in that. Europeans are divided. The majority, the global majority, that is the countries of Latin America. Mr. Perez mentioned President Petro of Colombia, who's been very outspoken. The countries of Africa, the countries of West Asia generally, East Asia, which is largely Muslim, people forget. Indonesia has been the site of many demonstrations against the American support of genocide. All these, the global majority, sometimes called the global South, is totally turned off by the United States and our behavior. And so we have paid a huge price, and so has Israel. And Israel will find it very difficult to wash off the stain of having itself. Well, Israelis are the victims of genocide, and perfectly understandable why they have strong feelings about that. But how they could turn around and commit genocide against others is inexplicable to most of the world. And so they've lost their moral standing, and so have we.
Right. Okay. Next up, I want to give the floor to Mary Jane Freeman, who I understand is not related to you.
So I'm told. But I'd be happy to be related if we could compare genealogical tables.
That would be great, but I don't think so, since it's through marriage that I have inherited my last name.
Well, maybe your husband. Anyway.
You'd have to go through Poland.
Well, that's probably unlikely.
I
do have Viking blood, but and the Poles have a lot of it. But anyway, go ahead.
Right. Well, given what you presented, it's kind of, I want to take a different tack, which is that given the cascading events with the Israelis, now engulfing Syria, Lebanon, Iran, and a similar escalation going on in NATO towards the Ukraine-Russia theater of war, it seems to me we're on a path towards nuclear confrontation. I'm with the Schiller Institute, Helga Zepp-LaRouche has proposed that we need solutions. And with regard to the current situation in certainly Southwest Asia, we've promoted a plan called the Oasis Plan.
Right.
That if people need to start thinking about, we end the war, we get the humanitarian aid in there, and then what do we do? And we're not going to tell anyone what to do, but we need to have the plans available. So in my question to you, given your long distinguished career as a diplomat, how do we restore American diplomacy? John Quincy Adams did talk about good diplomacy, and we used to have it. So that's my question.
Well, I know Helga, and I have spoken at some gatherings of the Schiller Institute because it is fearlessly honest in its discussion of many issues. It is entirely true that there is a serious danger that the escalating proxy war in Ukraine might become a direct confrontation between Russia, the United States, NATO on the other side. And that is something that we should be very concerned about because it could very likely go nuclear. I would point out that we have a similar confrontational policy with China over the civil war that has not ended there between Taipei and Beijing, and China is itself preparing a more formidable nuclear deterrent which could lead to nuclear escalation there. And finally, I'd note in West Asia, which is the term I prefer to the Middle East, because West Asia is non-prejudicial. The Middle East is the middle between something else. And it was actually invented by Alfred Thayer Mann, because the British called it the Near East because it was Near East for them. It was intermediate between us. Europe was the Near East for us, and India, which was the Far East. Anyway, I think we should remember that the Israeli nuclear doctrine centers around something called the Samson option, which if you have read the Bible, was the defiant act of a strong Philistine pulling down the temple around him rather than submitting to the dictation of Israel. So there is a doctrine which basically says if we go, everybody goes. So this is not trivial. Finally, I'll just say, I think the Oasis Plan, which I have read in detail, is a very sound approach. If we can ever get there, it would be wonderful. But at the moment, we're not even talking to people. I just read something in Foreign Affairs magazine advocating shuttle diplomacy, and I laughed. Shuttle between whom? We don't talk to the Iranians. The Israelis ignore us. The Turks are alienated. The Saudis are annoyed. The UAE is the grand practitioner of realpolitik in the region, and it talks to us, but we don't listen to anybody. And the key to diplomacy is two things. First, empathy, understanding why the other party has the views that it does, in part because that's the only, if you don't understand that, you can't figure out how to persuade them to take a different view. And the object of diplomacy is to persuade others to do things your way. And second, of course, you can't do that without listening. So I've spoken too much, and I will listen to the next question.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Freeman. Thank you both, Mary Jane. I want to take this moment to welcome, if he wants to speak with us, our special friend and past speaker and future speaker, Mr. Ray McGovern. And I want to take a moment to introduce him in case people don't know. Mr. Ray McGovern is a over 30-year veteran of the CIA, CIA intelligence analyst, and where he had many duties, including giving the president's daily brief to presidential administration. Ray, welcome. Please unmute, and I'd love to hear any thoughts or comments you might have.
Thank you, Amar. I'll be very brief. I just want to compliment Ambassador Freeman for not talking like an ambassador, but rather giving us cold facts. We are wholly responsible for this genocide. Let us not blanch before that reality, all of us. Who was it? Rabbi Heschel said, we're not all perpetrators of evil, but we're all responsible for evil, because acquiescence in evil is worse than doing evil itself. So if we take the lessons from this array of facts, cold facts, I think we need to get off our rear ends and do something within the next 5 weeks if we can. The other thing I'll just say is that when Ambassador Freeman was asked about his posting as the director of the National Intelligence Council in March of 2009, I was going to ask him with tongue in cheek, why didn't he, during his tenure as director of the National Intelligence Council, fix all this, do an estimate and make sure people know which end is up? His answer would have been, well, I was only in that position for about 5 hours.
Exactly.
Before the rule. What was that?
Maybe 6 hours.
6 hours before the lobby got me. So
Yeah, exactly.
The point here is simply that the intelligence community itself is corrupted by all this. Never has an intelligence estimate been done objectively on Israel, and that starts with James Jesus Angleton, and I was around in those days. And so just as you get Tony Blinken saying, and Biden himself saying, Putin has lost the war in Ukraine, well, they get similar disinformation on Israel. And Biden is now between a rock and a hard place. What he said today is sort of interesting. Maybe he's waking up and seeing that he's being played by Netanyahu. I guess the only other thing I'll say is that I really like this paraplegic diplomacy business. And I just remind people who don't know this, another fact, which I didn't hear included in Ambassador Freeman's remarks, and that is that after 1967, when the U.S. press played this as an Israeli response to Arab aggression, namely Egyptian aggression, and none other than previous Prime Minister Menachem Begin came to Washington and addressed a very high-level audience. And this is what he said, very, very brief. The Egyptian army concentrations in the Sinai approaches did not prove that Nasser was really about to attack us. We must be honest with ourselves. We decided to attack him and the USS Liberty and all manner of other people. So let's be aware that not only is this supreme arrogance, but that we are enabling it. And unless we get more enlightened leadership in Washington and more objectivity on the part of intelligence advisors, this is just going to go further down. Sorry to be so pessimistic. Thanks so much, Ambassador Freeman.
Well, thanks, Ray. Where are we now, Amr?
I think we have about 20 minutes before wrapping up, and we have a few questions. I think Ray's comments give us the opportunity, Ambassador Freeman, for you to address a question that comes up commonly in these events. People always ask this question: what can they do? People who are unsatisfied with the state of affairs, what can they do?
And the answer, I'm sorry to say, is very little. You can agitate. You can bring this issue to the attention of the American people. And that's something that Ray has done repeatedly. With how much effect, Ray, would you say? Anyway, at some point you have to ask yourself, if not me, then who? What shall I do? I think our political parties are the prisoners of the Israel lobby. They are Tweedledee and Tweedledum on this issue, and on some others as well. I intend to register a dissent. I don't believe that my dissent will produce an election result that I like. But I will produce a dissent, because for the first time in a long time, these issues which we've discussed tonight are under discussion in our country. And youth in particular has been brave, and many of them are Jewish, and I applaud them for their conscience. I think one of the most tragic things about what has happened, and I hope I made that clear in my talk, is that Zionism has emerged as the negation of Judaism. Judaism is a religion characterized by two admirable characteristics. One is a focus on justice, and that is why American Jews have been in the forefront of the pursuit of justice for other ethnic groups like African Americans in this country. And the other is an emphasis on ethical reasoning through scholarship. In this, they resemble the Jesuits. I don't know, Ray, where you come out on that, but these are admirable characteristics, and they've gone to Israel to die. And I hope they stay alive. I think the Jewish communities in our country have made enormous contributions. They should continue to do so. We should admire those contributions. We should not immediately attribute to them knee-jerk support for what is happening in West Asia. Some of them may be guilty of that. Let us hope that with time and reason and the proffering of more facts, that they will follow their fellow religionists in a crisis of conscience. That's what brought apartheid to the end in South Africa. And it has to happen here too.
I'll read you a question in the chat from Mr. Herbert Weiner. Herbert writes, what about the forces for peace in Israel, including individuals in the IDF, Shin Bet Mossad, who desire a two-state solution?
Well, I think, Mr. Weiner, you seem to be visible over on the corner there, but thank you for the question. There have been some notable peace advocates and some very brave people in Israel. I think of Gideon Levy, who writes a daily column in Haaretz. I think of Uri Avneri, who's now no longer here. But there are many people of conscience who have tried to deflect Zionism from the course that it has been on. And some of them were my friends. I can't say Gideon Levy is my friend because I've met him only at a distance. Uri Avneri and I were in frequent correspondence. So there are many decent people in Israel, or there were. Many of them have left. You know, there are 200 and some thousand Israelis now living in Berlin, of all places. And, you know, I would say, well, they're there in part to get away from the likes of Bezalel Smotrich and Ben Gvir, Itamar Ben Gvir, who are a disgrace. They are overt fascists, racists, and Jewish supremacists. And many people in Israel don't agree with that. On the other hand, one can understand the desire for vengeance after October 7th, but it has not gone refuted by the public in the way that it should have been. The focus has been on hostage release, not on peace, not on reconciling with the Palestinians. And I know that in 76 years of its existence, Israel has never made a proposal for peaceful coexistence with the Palestinians, or even with its neighbors. It was Sadat who went to Jerusalem, not Menachem Begin who went to Cairo. So let's be realistic about this. There are heroes in Israel, some of them very vocal, who suffer for their giving voice and their espousal of morality, but that is an amoral state that is unusually cruel and has become the most hated state on the planet, a pariah, as the walkout on Netanyahu's speech at the UN General Assembly illustrated. But more than that, regarded as a quintessential committer of evil. And we are associated with it in that regard.
A question that was raised earlier was that why is Iran so restrained in their response to Israeli actions?
Now, that's an interesting question. Iran has exactly been very restrained. This has caused tremendous problems, political problems, for the newly elected president of Iran, Pezeshkian, who came to office as a moderate in Iranian politics, whose platform was to improve relations with the West, who argued for a renewed dialogue about the nuclear program in Iran and the restoration of the so-called JCPOA, or the nuclear deal with Iran, which President Biden campaigned on restoring and which he didn't do. This man, who was somebody who would have been very worthwhile talking to, is under attack in Iran for having been restrained, and he was. During his inauguration in Tehran, Ismail Haniyeh, the head of Hamas, the political head of Hamas, was assassinated by Israel. Nasrallah was just assassinated with 86 bunker-busting bombs in Beirut, along with hundreds of other people. This is a residential neighborhood in Beirut. The collateral damage was huge. And Iran basically is restrained. Why? Because it does not want a war with either the United States or with Israel. It is committed to the Palestinian cause, but not to the extent of going to war with Israel. I note that the Tuesday Iranian barrage of missiles at Israel was brief, limited, 180, 200 missiles. Iran immediately announced that it had finished its reprisal. It was not going to continue it. And that was an obvious signal that it did not want a wider war. It wanted an end to the cycle of violence. It has been subjected to repeated assassinations of its scientists and political personnel from Israel. There's a very good book, which I urge those who have not read it to do, and that is called Rise and Kill First. And it is by an Israeli journalist who's very competent and who documents 3,000 Israeli murders of politicians, mostly Arab, some Iranian, some European. This is a classic technique of Israeli policy, and it leads nowhere. And I think Mr. Pezeshkian wanted to break that pattern, but he now will not have the chance, because Netanyahu has already said that he will retaliate. He will continue, try to provoke Iran to do something that would bring the United States into the war. And if he can't do it with a direct attack on Iran, he may very well, in the classic Israeli fashion, do it with a false flag operation.
Okay. In our last few minutes here, one is because you're here with us. This is a special opportunity, and you're an expert on many regions of the world. We want to switch gears a little bit, and we're very interested to hear your thoughts, analysis about the apparent decline of the United States and the apparent rise of the BRICS countries. Could you talk about that?
The BRICS basically began as a protest movement internationally against American unilateralism. Most people apparently don't know that the United Nations Charter prohibits sanctions unless they are approved by the UN Security Council. The United States routinely ignores this. In fact, coercive measures like sanctions, or sending in the Marines, or starting a war, have become our usual modus operandi in foreign policy. The issue for other countries is our use of dollar transactions, our sovereignty over the dollar, to prohibit them from doing trade with each other or settling trade deals in dollars. And we've seen this applied to Russia, we've seen it applied to Iran. And I would add, we've also gotten into the habit of confiscating the reserves of those we oppose, like the Russians or the Iranians or the Venezuelans, who lost their gold in Britain to confiscation. So we are behaving in a lawless fashion, and the BRICS have decided to provide an alternative. And they will have a meeting in Kazan in Russia a little later in this month, about 3 weeks from now, in which one of the main items on the table, in addition to further expansion of membership, which has now reached 9, I believe. Argentina, before the Milei election, was to join, but Milei declined to join. Interestingly, he's now headed for Beijing on bended knee with his hand out. But, even an anarcho-capitalist like him can be realistic if forced to be. So the main agenda will be finding alternatives to trade settlement in the dollar. The reason the dollar has its role as a reserve currency is because it preserves value, supposedly. And 2 problems have arisen. One is you can't use the dollar if you have it because of US sanctions. So we are prohibiting the use of it to settle trade. Second, the United States now is deeply in debt. We have a public debt that exceeds our gross domestic product. Private debt in the United States is even larger, around 167% of GDP. Don't hold me to that figure, but I believe that's the figure. The world is beginning to wonder what the plan is to pay all this debt off. And Larry Summers once said, well, it's easy. We'll just inflate our economy and the dollar will lose value and that'll solve the problem we won't have to solve. But, we're on the verge of losing the ability to buy goods and services by printing little green paper portraits of dead presidents. Now, that's been very important to us. And it's in jeopardy. So the BRICS began as a protest movement. They're becoming more effective. There will be 100 countries represented in Kazan, and there will be an expansion of the membership. And they are beginning to develop trade and investment rules for trade and investment among their members that exclude us. And I would add here that, Pacific Asia is the global center of the world economy now. And we have decided we're not going to participate in making rules for trade and investment there. So when the Trans-Pacific Partnership was proposed, both Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump opposed it, and Donald Trump canceled it. Ergo, we're not at the table. And as all of you know, the old American adage is true: if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And so we will see what happens at Kazan.
And for our last question tonight, could you talk with us a little bit more about the U.S. relationship with China and a potential conflict with China? I know it's a big topic, but...
Too big. Let me just make a few points. China now has an industrial economy that's 3 times ours. It produces 36% of the world's goods. We produce 12%. In purchasing power terms, its economy is 1/3 larger than ours. Don't believe this nonsense of comparisons in GDP. Let me give you an example. If you have a credit card debt and the interest rate goes up, it's probably going down, but if it goes up, so you were paying $1,000 a month in interest, now you're going to pay $1,200. US GDP just went up because you paid more in interest. If you compare the United States and Chinese economies in terms of how many tax accountants, lawyers, insurance salesmen, insurance bureaucrats each side has, we come out way ahead. If you want to know about how many ships we build 5. They build 1,500 a year. If you want to know about what counts, then don't use GDP, which was a concept invented in the 1930s that is useful for measuring trends, but is not useful for comparisons. So I would say the final point is, despite all our angst about China and the challenge it poses, it certainly poses the challenge in economic and technological terms. I mentioned the economic factors. It is the largest trading partner of virtually everybody in the world. It's the largest lender to most countries in the world, a creditor. We borrow money, they lend it. But technologically, there is something called the Australian Strategic Technology Institute that evaluates innovation in 64 technologies on 300 factors. It's a serious enterprise. China is now ahead, according to them, in 57 of the 64. We are ahead in, well, South Korea is ahead in 2, and we get the rest. They are graduating 4,000 scientists, technologists, engineers, and mathematicians a year. We graduate 800, of whom about a third are Chinese. So you can draw your own conclusions about where this is going. It is stupid to make a relationship with China purely competitive rather than cooperative. Science and technology economies advance by collaboration, not by mutual isolation. And finally, we have decided, because the only thing we have is a military, that we have to reply to the Chinese with military terms. They're not, there's no Chinese fleet off San Diego, Puget Sound, or Norfolk. There is an American fleet off Shanghai and Xiamen. And we run 3 to 4 aggressive, intrusive patrols each day, intended to cause them to fear an attack and light up their radar, so we can pick a way through it in the event we actually have a war. And finally, I know China's a nuclear power, and we are disputing what the territory of China is. There was a civil war which ended in our helping Chiang Kai-shek to go to Taiwan. Taiwan's evolved a great deal. It has a wonderfully robust democracy, and I admire it greatly, but it's still a civil war, and we're in the middle of it. When we confronted the Soviet Union during the Cold War, Ray will correct me, we nominally rejected the Soviet sovereignty over the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. In fact, we didn't contest that. And now we're contesting the sovereignty over Taiwan. And our president, who has no constitutional authority to do so, has on 4 occasions proclaimed a defense commitment to Taiwan, which we agreed to give up when we normalized with Beijing. And I could go on, but I won't, because time is late. People are probably very tired of hearing me, and I need to go to bed.
Okay. I had one more question, but actually I think we'll leave it at that then.
No, go ahead with one more question. That's it. That will put the cap on it.
Okay. Last question. Another massive topic that deserves a whole night or multiple nights on its own. But if you can, could you please share with us what you think are some key points we should know about the war in Ukraine and the U.S. relationship or lack of relationship with Russia?
Where to start? In December 2021, Russia, which had been warning the United States since 1994 that if we attempted to incorporate Ukraine into our sphere of influence, known as NATO, they would feel threatened and feel obliged to react militarily, issued an ultimatum. They demanded that we talk. We enter a negotiation about 3 things. 1, restoring neutrality to Ukraine. That was the original basis for Ukrainian independence, not incorporating it into NATO. 2nd, reaffirming the Minsk Accords, which gave linguistic rights to Russian-speaking Ukrainians, equivalent to those that French-speaking Canadians have in Quebec. And third, that we agree to a broader discussion of European security architecture to find a way to relieve the threat to Russia and the threat, perceived threat from Russia to the rest of Europe. We said we will not talk. Russia then made good on its threat, its ultimatum, and invaded Ukraine. And that was arguably illegal, but it had been foretold. Interestingly, to go back to Ray McGovern's comment about the intelligence community, we had it both ways. We said, Russia is bluffing. They'll never dare to attack us in our client state, Ukraine. And at the same time, we predicted they would. And the predictions were almost entirely wrong. That is to say, they didn't do the battle plan that we thought they had. They did something really rather spastic and ill-prepared, and didn't work out very well for them. I'll just conclude by saying that this has been very bad for Ukraine. We started this war with the premise that we could use Ukraine, that we could fight to the last Ukrainian against Russia. Well, Ukraine is running out of Ukrainians, and that is reflected in the battlefield. And all of the, BS that the New York Times, the Washington Post, and other major news media in the United States have put out is being refuted on the battlefield. Now, even Zelensky's talking about a negotiation. There must be a negotiation. All wars must end. Typically, they end with one side or another finding a way to accept the results on the battlefield. I know of not a single instance where negotiations have produced an outcome that refutes results on the battlefield. Negotiators, no matter how good they are very seldom able to improve on what the military do. And Ukraine has lost this war. And I would say finally that all of the nonsense about Russia proceeding to Paris as it did in the Napoleonic War is nonsense. Russia has not demonstrated the capacity even to conquer Ukraine, let alone proceed through Poland, Germany, and other countries that aren't exactly patsies to take the rest of Europe to the Pyrenees and beyond. So I think we need to wake up, be realistic. We're not going to get it in this administration, which leaves behind a legacy of grotesque human rights violations in West Asia, a losing war in Ukraine, a confrontation with China that is unnecessary and very risky, no dialogue with Iran, a Middle East in which China now has replaced us as the central diplomatic agent, the go-to country for peace. And for what? What have we accomplished? So I'll leave it there. That is a very bleak way to end this discussion. But somebody asked you about Ukraine, and that is a very bleak story.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Freeman, and thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, spending your time with us tonight. Ambassador Freeman, you speaking with the community church tonight, you continue the church's tradition of hearing from prominent expert speakers on a variety of topics. So thank you again very much. I want to close tonight's program with a very quick reading. I've read it before, but I'd just like to read it again because I think it speaks to the topic we discussed tonight from kind of a spiritual perspective. This is a very quick reading from the Quran. In the Quran, God says, this is from chapter 2, verse 83. God writes, "Remember when we took a pledge from the children of Israel. Worship none but God. Be good to your parents and your kinsfolk. Be good to orphans and the poor. Speak good words to all people. Keep up the prayer and pay the prescribed alms." Then all but a few of you turned away and paid no heed. We took a pledge from you. Do not shed one another's blood or drive one another from your homelands. You acknowledged it at the time, and you can testify to this. Yet here you are, killing one another and driving some of your own people from their homes, helping one another in sin and aggression against them. So do you believe in some parts of the scripture and not in others? The punishment for those of you who do this will be nothing but disgrace in this life. And on the day of resurrection, they will be condemned to the harshest torment. God is not unaware of what you do. These are the people who buy the life of this world at the price of the hereafter. So that's from sorry, go ahead, Ambassador Freeman.
I just said, I mean.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us, and please have a great rest of your night.
Thank you very much for listening to me, and please feel free to disagree with me.